Remember that point around the late 90s and early 2000s when the media just kept trying to blame video games on everything that was wrong with the world? Well, Rockstar Games were usually the ones in the firing line, and their 2003 title Manhunt is a classic example of how ugly things could possibly get. It got to the point where the game even got banned in Australia, and simply talking about it in the first place is actually enough grounds for the Australian gaming police to come to your house and arrest you. Hang on a sec, wait.
Police, open up!
In Manhunt, you're playing as a guy named James L. Cash, an unlikable asshole on death row who finds himself miraculously alive after his so-called lethal injection, and soon following the orders of a mysterious figure calling himself the Director, voiced by Brian Cox.
Okay, are you ready? Camera, action.
In return for his freedom, Cash is instructed to move through various areas of the city, killing gang members along the way as violently as possible, for the amusement of the Director, who's recording everything for an underground snuff film ring. Pretty edgy stuff. The various gangs that you fight along the way are a little bit reminiscent of the gangs from the 1979 film The Warriors, with names like the Hoods, the War Dogs, and the Smileys, and they each have their own distinct appearances too. All that's missing is the Baseball Furies, the Lizzies, and the Riffs.
Riffs!
Anyway, Manhunt was kind of known back then for its violence levels, which made it so notorious, and yeah, the game is pretty damn violent, but I think a lot of the controversy was misguided. There was a quote from someone who said about the game during its period of controversy that a 12-year-old could navigate through this entire game in one sitting. And then some dickbag also said there's no challenge, just assembly line ritualistic slaughter. Now, both of these statements are total bullshit. For starters, you're not going to get through this game in one sitting, unless you've got a really long attention span. The second comment is also untrue, because Manhunt is a really challenging game at times. It's a stealth game, but it's one that requires a lot of patience from the player, I think more so than a lot of other stealth games out there. In case it wasn't obvious from the title, the aim of the game is to hunt man, and the vast majority of kills in this game are going to come from one of the melee weapons. Using an equipped weapon, Cash is able to execute enemies in brutal fashion depending on the weapon you're using and how long you're holding down the attack button before releasing it. So if you're using a baseball bat against someone, Cash might just whack them in the back of the head a couple of times, but hold down the attack button until it's in the red and he'll first choke them to near death so they're weak on their knees, then slam them in the goddamn head, causing their skull to split open and brains to spill out. And it's also impressive how many of these there are. For each weapon you can execute someone with, there's always going to be 3 separate animations for each level of execution. Gotta say though, nothing really beats the plastic bag, and covering someone's face up to suffocate them before beating their head to a pulp is just adding insult to injury. But what kind of surprised me the most though is that outside of the simple shock value, the more you play it, you begin to see that Manhunt actually has a really well developed stealth system. Using some basic line of sight mechanics, but also the concept of Cash being in either the light or shadow, with the darkness rendering you practically invisible to enemies. Enemies are going to be very vocal when patrolling, talking to themselves a fair bit, which reminds me a lot of the NPCs in Thief the Dark Project, and it serves as a means of increasing the player's immersion, but also subtly making you aware of their position without giving them giant icons above their head, or having them glow through walls or other such nonsense we get in modern so-called stealth games. Another big component is the way noise works, and this kind of factors into a bunch of different things. Firstly, your movement speed and the kind of surface you're moving across. So sneaking makes the least amount of noise, then walking before sprinting, where you may as well have a bell around your neck. Using certain weapons can also send out noise in a perimeter, so if you execute someone too close to someone else, then chances are they're going to hear you. One of the handiest tactics in the game is whacking a wall or an object to get an enemy's attention, where they'll often slowly walk over to where you made the noise, then stand there for a bit investigating before slowly walking back, allowing you to often get the jump on them from behind. When you are detected, enemies become absolutely ruthless, often drawing the attention of every other deadbeat in the area and chasing after you.
Yoo-hoo!
You can lose them if you hightail it out of there, but they're pretty damn good at staying on your ass. When they're in some kind of alert state, they'll dynamically search the surroundings to flush you out, and I have to admit I was pretty surprised at how extensive they often were. My issue though is that it's just not often all that consistent. Whacking walls or solid objects is the best way to get someone's attention and draw them to your position. But every now and then an NPC is just going to refuse to investigate. I mean, they'll just flat out ignore the noise you're making. Often too, when they do investigate, they'll stop short of the point you made the noise, which kind of defeats the purpose of trying to make a noise to, lure them around a corner, if they stop short of the corner itself. Being seen is forgiving to an extent though, and eventually, like most stealth games, they'll get bored of chasing for the player, forget you exist, and go back to doing what they were originally doing. which is honestly for the best because you really don't want to be getting into fights in this game. Why is that? Well, because the melee combat in this game is just absolute garbage.
Damn, while you... Get off!
The closest comparison I could make, considering it's a Rockstar game, is the melee combat in GTA 3. You know, we just pretty much take turns with the AI hitting each other, and that's how it feels in Manhunt. At least so in Manhunt, you've got some kind of block ability which you use by moving backwards during combat. And you can also grapple enemies to get off a couple of quick hits if you time it right. But it's nothing amazing or even fluid in the slightest, it just kinda sucks. You're really just, as I said, trading blows with the AI, trying to block most of their incoming attacks, as they'll often do the same. Then eventually they'll go down and you can stomp them to finish them off. This only applies though when it's one-on-one, and if there's even a single other opponent, you're better off running away, like a little bitch. Combat being bad shouldn't matter all that much. I mean, it is a stealth game, but there's the odd times when you encounter someone that you have to fight to the death and you don't have the option of avoiding. So at one point or another, you're going to encounter how terrible the melee combat is. But then there's the shooting sections, and honestly, I don't even know where to start. If you think the melee combat is bad, well, wait until you get to one of these scenes when you're forced into shooting. For starters, the crosshair has no bearing on where a shot is actually going to go. Sure, it's going to go in that general direction, but I've found a lot of the time that despite my crosshair being on an enemy's head, it often just simply doesn't register as a headshot. All of the weapons seem to have a range of about 10 to 15 meters where they just simply stop doing damage. Now, I know this makes sense for a weapon like the sawn-off shotgun, but for a revolver or a pistol, yeah, no, I don't think so. Later in the game, you're just running these gauntlets of enemies, up to a dozen at once, and it's just not fun. It's horrid, and they try to make it even more challenging in a lame way by really spacing out the manual save points. Playing through these scenes is the kind of thing that makes you wish for a nuclear winter. I'd rather the entire game be a stealth game and they just got rid of these scenes entirely because I honestly find them sloppy and just unenjoyable. You can tell they've tried to add them in to create some kind of variety, and there's a shift about halfway through the campaign, and every second mission or so from here on in, you're forced into shooting things. And it would be fine if the shooting wasn't so terrible. You just end up wanting to go back to lurking from the shadows and chopping and picking people to pieces with machetes or axes. Speaking of picking, you could pick apart the presentation if you really wanted to, but it's a game made for consoles in 2003, so I think it's kind of pointless. And besides that, the game makes up for what it lacks in visual prowess with just an awesome atmosphere that really feels like you're in some kind of 80s horror flick. The music in particular sounds like something from an early John Carpenter film or a slasher movie. It's this great combination of dark electronic ambience that ramps up during those moments when you're detected to fit the action perfectly. The sound design too is really just top notch, it's amazing stuff, and it's pretty damn tense at times, and the general feel of everything with those distorted VHS filters when you take down enemies really makes it feel like you're taking part in this horrible, messed up snuff tape. Now, it is kind of funny looking back at Manhunt in 2018 and taking into account how horrible and violent the game was deemed at the time of its release, considering it is pretty tame by today's standards. It is still violent, but I don't think it's quite as bad anymore as people made it out to be. Considering there was a time in society where people thought that women wearing bikinis was about as outrageous as you could possibly get, it's no surprise that people found Manhunt horrifying upon release. The word is that even people working for Rockstar at the time were kind of disgusted with it. I mean, there's definitely more violent games out there. In fact, the second game, Manhunt 2, makes the first game look like Kirby's Adventure in comparison. Not only are the executions even more grisly and well animated, but there's a whole heap of new weapons to kill people with, like buzzsaws and hedge trimmers, and you can also now perform firearm executions as well, which generally just involves blowing someone's goddamn head off. There's also unique environmental kills where you can murder someone in some kind of over-the-top fashion with whatever happens to be nearby. I think gameplay-wise, Manhunt 2 has objectively improved mechanics, like the shooting for instance feels loads better, which is handy because there's even more of it than before. Though overall it lacks the atmosphere of the first game, but that's all I'll say about it. I'll leave the proper review for another video. So all violence aside, if you can overlook some of the shoddy gameplay elements, I think Manhunt is still largely playable. It's also a surprisingly long game. I mean, there's 20 levels or scenes all up, which can often take upwards of 30 or so minutes for a first time playthrough. For me, though, I've got to say that Manhunt was a 50-50. I mean, I love the game's atmosphere, the sound design, and the soundtrack, which is just amazing in every single way. And once I got a hang of the stealth mechanics, it was really fun pulling bad guys away from the pack and executing them one by one. As a stealth game with horror elements and a dark, gritty story, it's pretty damn awesome though. And I think the only other games that had this kind of atmosphere was the Thief series, and I think even comparing Manhunt to those games is compliment enough. Don't do what I did and be an idiot and buy it expensively off eBay. There's plenty of sites that sell it for dirt cheap as a digital download. And if you don't have a stick up your ass, go buy it, play it, murder gangbangers with axes and crowbars, and you'll finally be able to see what all the fuss was about.